It is one of the greatest and longest-lasting realms of men in all Middle-earth. Rising from the ashes of Numenor, it would survive war, plague, and turmoil for over 3,000 years before finally seeing the return of the king. Today on Nerd of the Rings, we covered the history of Gondor. After the downfall of Numenor, the 5 ships of Isildur and Anarion were brought to the southern lands of Middle-earth, while their father Elendil and his 4 ships were taken north. In 3320 of the Second Age, the brothers continue their voyage up the Anduin River, landing in the heart of the new realm they would build, Gondor. While known as a great kingdom in later days, Gondor was initially subservient to Elendil's northern kingdom of Arnor. Isildur and Anarion rule as kings of Gondor, while Elendil rules over both realms as the High King. Isildur settles in and rules over the lands of Ithilien. He builds the Tower of Minas Ithil on the border of Gondor and Mordor as a direct threat to Sauron. Minas Ithil, meaning Tower of the Moon, is where Isildur plants the sapling of the White Tree of Nimloth, which he had saved from Numenor. Meanwhile, Anarion builds the city of Minas Anor, the Tower of the Sun, directly to the west across the river. Between their 2 cities, the brothers established the first capital of their realm, Osgiliath. The capital city is known for its beauty and has great stone bridges going over the river Anduin. Aside from the great craftsmanship shown in the construction of these 3 cities, the early Gondorians were also responsible for some of the most iconic monuments and buildings in all Middle-earth. The Second Age Gondorians constructed the Tower of Orthanc, made of unbreakable black stone. Another great black stone is one Isildur brings from Numenor, the Stone of Erech, upon which the King of the Mountains swears an oath that he will one day break. Gondor also builds a fortress within its realm of Calinarthon at Aglarond, also known as the Glittering Caves, with other wonders to follow in their later history. Among these great cities and fortresses are spread 4 of the 7 Palantiri, rescued from the fall of Numenor. Isildur and Anarion place 1 in each of their cities of Minas Anor and Minas Ithil. They place 1 in the capital of Osgiliath, and 1 is stationed in the Tower of Orthanc at the northern border of their realm. Among the citizens of this newly formed kingdom are men of Numenor who already lived in Middle-earth. These people, many of whom were among the faithful, and at least partially of Numenorian descent, lived in long-held Numenorian colonies like Belfalas and Pelargir. The nobles of Belfalas were given a hereditary princedom, from which we would eventually get Imrahil, the prince of Dol Amroth. Despite its role as the lesser kingdom, Gondor is, from the very beginning, more powerful and populous than the northern Arnor. Though soon enough, Gondor would have to look north for aid. Shortly after the cities of Minas Anor, Osgiliath, and Minas Ithil are finished, the fires of Orodruin awaken, signaling the return of Sauron. Being survivors of Numenor, the Gondorians were aware of Sauron from his time on the Island Kingdom, though this was their first proof that he had survived the destruction. From this moment onward, the men of Gondor refer to Orodruin as Amon Amarth, or Mount Doom. In 3429, Sauron begins his quest for vengeance upon the men of Numenor. He launches an attack upon Minas Ithil, forcing Isildur to retreat along with his family and a seedling of the White Tree of Gondor. He sails down the Anduin and out to sea, before going to his father in Arnor. Meanwhile, Anarion is left to hold out against Sauron, protecting Minas Anor and Osgiliath for the next 5 years. He would in fact succeed in driving Sauron's forces back to the Efel Duath, but as their enemy gathers reinforcements, they know they cannot hold the line indefinitely. Finally, in 3434 of the Second Age, Isildur would return alongside his father, Elrond Half-Elven, and the High King of the Noldor, Gil-galad, in the last alliance of elves and men. Anarion would join this host at the northwest corner of Mordor, where they fight Sauron's forces in the Battle of Dagorlad. While the death toll is great, especially among the Sylvan elves, the Alliance is victorious and presses on to Sauron's own fortress. For the next 7 years, the Alliance lays siege to Barad-dûr. In the 6th year of the siege, Anarion is struck by a rock thrown from the tower and killed. Finally, in 3441, Sauron himself comes forth from Barad-dûr. So great was his attack that he pushes the Alliance back to the slopes of Mount Doom. But there, Sauron comes face to face with the High Kings of Elves and Men, Gil-galad and Elendil. The three fight in legendary combat until all three are thrown down. In this moment, Isildur takes the hilt shard of his father's sword and cuts the One Ring from Sauron's hand. No longer able to hold his physical form, Sauron's spirit flees, and the Alliance is victorious. Isildur returns to Gondor after the leveling of Barad-dûr and the destruction of Sauron's forces. With his father and brother both slain in the war, he is now in line to become the new High King. At the border of Anórien and Calenarthon, Isildur constructs a secret tomb for Elendil upon Amon Anwar. He would also plant the seedling of the White Tree in Minas Anor, in memory of his brother. And after 2 years of preparing his nephew Menelil for rule, he leaves Gondor in the hands of its third king. Isildur departs Gondor in the 2nd year of the Third Age, intending to take up the high kingship of both Gondor and Arnor in Annúminas. Instead, he would die after an ambush by orcs, and the One Ring is lost to the Anduin. Despite the loss of Isildur, both Gondor and Arnor would grow in wealth and power for the next 800 years. Gondor's growth would only briefly be interrupted by an Easterling invasion in 492 of the Third Age. And while Arnor would eventually begin its steady decline into ruin, Gondor would continue marching to prosperity. From 830 to 1149, Gondor experiences its Golden Age, a period of rule by 4 consecutive rulers, collectively known as the Ship Kings. These kings, Taranon Falastur, Eärnil I, Kiriandil, and Kirjaher, would seek to expand Gondor's might in both military and navy. Taranon, the first of these kings, extends Gondor's realm both west and south of the mouths of Anduin. Taranon is also known as the husband of Queen Baruthiel, a black Númenórean known for being nefarious, solitary, and loveless, and of course, for her spy cats, all of which is covered in my Black Númenóreans video. Taranon is the first king of Gondor to die without an heir to his throne, and having years earlier cast his wife out to sea adrift aboard a ship, the crown passes to his nephew, Eärnil I. Eärnil continues the expansion of his uncle by constructing a great navy and repairing the old Númenórean port of Pelargir. Despite the greatness Gondor had achieved, it was not yet the supreme power of the coasts of Middle-earth, for there was still the haven of Umbar, also a former Númenórean port, but under the control of Black Númenóreans and Haradrim. In 933 of the Third Age, 20 years into his kingship, Eärnil attacks the forces of Umbar, seizing control of the harbor and as a result, the seas of Middle-earth. Still, the sea itself was not tamed, for just 3 years later, Eärnil is lost at sea and never seen again. His son, Kiriandil, rises to the kingship. This third ship king continues the practice of building ever more ships, though he would die 79 years later in Umbar, when the Haradrim, led by the lords exiled by his father, lay siege to the city. Kirjaher then becomes the fourth and final ship king. He seeks vengeance for his father's death, and after building up his armies, he attacks Harad by both land and sea in a decisive victory in 1050. He forces the defeated kings of Harad to acknowledge the overlordship of Gondor, and dubs himself Hayarmendasil, meaning South Victor. At this moment, Gondor is at the very height of its power, both militarily and in terms of lands occupied. Their lands stretched from Celebrant in the north to Harnan and Umbar in the south. from the Grey Flood in the west to the Sea of Rhûn in the east. The realm was now spread far and wide, but it would not last, for lesser kings, plague, and civil war were on the horizon. With Hyar-Mendicil's death in 1149, his son Atanatar takes the throne as the 16th king of Gondor. During his 77-year reign, the strength and wealth of Gondor would begin to deteriorate. The 19th king was Romendicil II, who would take the crown in 1304. And while there had been 2 kings between these rulers, Romendicil was effectively the ruler during nearly the entire reigns of his father and uncle before him, after winning great renown in battle. During the rule of his uncle, the Easterlings resumed their attacks on Gondor, and during his battles, Romendicil discovers that not all the Northmen adhered to Gondor. Seeking to secure the region, he leads a great force from Gondor to attack the Easterling army, occupying the lands between Rhovanion and the Sea of Rhûn in 1248. His attack is a success, completely defeating the Easterlings west of the sea. It is then that he begins going by the name Romendicil, meaning East Victor. In that very year, Romendicil fortifies the western shore of the Anduin north through the lands of Calenarthon. It is at his behest that the Argonath, the great pillars of the kings Anarion and Isildur, are constructed north of Amon Hen. It's possible that the Seat of Seeing and the Seat of Hearing were also built during this time, given their proximity and Romendicil's interest in the north. He also took a special interest in the Northmen, many of whom he brought into his service. Romendicil even goes so far as to send his son to live among the Northmen, though this seemingly small act would bring civil war to Gondor. Prince Valakar would marry a woman of the Northmen and have a son named Eldakar. Valakar would rule for 66 years after his father's death, but when he dies in 1432, Eldakar takes the throne to the anger of many. For many Gondorians of Númenórean blood disapproved of Eldakar's mixed heritage and believed a half-breed had no right to rule. Chief among these was his second cousin, Castamir. Castamir was Gondor's captain of ships, and thus was supported by both Umbar and Pelargir, among other coastal regions of the realm. In 1437, 5 years into his cousin's rule, Castamir leads a rebellion and besieges the city of Osgiliath. During this attack, Osgiliath is covered in flames, and the Dome of Stars, a great hall in the capital, is destroyed, and its palantir is lost in the Anduin. In his sack of Osgiliath, Castamir first shows his utter cruelty and executes Eldakar's son, Ornendil. Thus begins the Kin-strife in Gondor, a topic that can and will get its own video in the future. But for now, we'll touch on some of the biggest key points. Eldakar goes into exile, fleeing to his mother's kin in Rhovanion. In turn, many of the Northmen previously loyal to Gondor, as well as Gondorians in the northern provinces, rally behind the rightful king. Castamir would rule Gondor for 10 years, continuing to show his true colors to his people, and steadily losing favor and becoming seen as the usurper he was. Finally, in 1447, Eldakar returns with a great army from Rhovanion and meets Castamir's forces at the crossings of Erui. Many are killed in this deadly conflict before Eldakar takes his vengeance upon Castamir, killing him in single combat. Castamir's sons retreat to the haven of Pelargir, where they would hold out for a year before sailing with all their forces to Umbar. Eldakar, who had no ships of his own, is unable to pursue them, and as a result, Gondor would lose control of Umbar for the next 400 years, as the sons of Castamir join the enemies of Gondor, bringing into existence the Corsairs of Umbar. The Corsairs would ally with the Haradrim in a war against Gondor, in which the new king, Eldakar's son Aldamir, was killed. 11 years later, in 1551, Aldamir's son would defeat the men of Harad in battle, avenging his father and taking the name Hyar-Mendicil II. The Corsairs would plague the coast of Gondor for many years, But another plague would become a much greater concern for Gondor in 1636. This plague affects a huge area of Middle-earth, and its source is an old and ancient foe. The plague coincides with the emergence of a shadow in Dol Guldur, and Sauron's plague would not only devastate Gondor, but their enemies to the east and south as well. We are told Osgiliath is especially hard hit, and people fleeing the city would cause Minas Anor to become the new capital of the kingdom. Meanwhile, Calenarthon is so hard hit by the plague that it is nearly completely abandoned. Among the casualties of this plague are not only thousands of Gondorians, but King Telimnar, all his children, and even the White Tree of Gondor. After the Kin-strife and now this great plague, Gondor has been severely weakened. In 1856 of the Third Age, enemies would once again come from the east. The spirit of Sauron once again moves the Easterlings into hostilities against Gondor. This group of Easterlings, known as the Wain Riders, traveled in great fortified camps of wagons and had invaded Rhovanion. King Narmacil II leads Gondor and the men of the north in the Battle of the Plains, south of Mirkwood. The battle is a disaster. Narmacil II is killed, and the Easterlings enslave the people of Rhovanion. Some of the Northmen would escape and flee to the upper vales of Anduin in their exile, becoming known as the Eotheid. The first lord of the Eotheid warns the new king, Kalimetar, who is determined to avenge his father, that the Wain Riders are preparing a raid on Calenarthon, but that the enslaved Northmen were also nearing a revolt. With time being precious, Kalimetar leads an army north, drawing the Wain Riders south to meet them at Dagorlad. As the battle seems in doubt, Kalimetar's secret cavalry crosses the Undeeps, meets up with the Eotheid riders, and arriving at the battle, assure their victory. Between the battle and the revolt in Rhovanion, the Wain Riders are driven back to the east. In 1940 of the Third Age, after many centuries of operating independently of one another, King Ondoher of Gondor meets with King Arafant of Arthedain, a splinter kingdom of the former Arnor. They realize that the wars and plagues and misfortune they've experienced are no mere coincidence. There is a single force, bent upon the destruction of the Dunedain. The kingdoms ally once more, in hopes of saving both from collapse, and Prince Arvedui marries Ondoher's daughter Firiel, further cementing their alliance. However, whatever alliance there was would be short-lived, and merely bring about another contest for the throne. Just 4 years after their alliance, Gondor's enemies make a coordinated assault. The Haradrim invade from the south, and just a few days later, Wain Riders return from the east. Ondoher's distant cousin, Eärnil II, leads an army south, while Ondoher leads an army north to meet the Wain Riders. The chariots and horsemen of the Easterlings wreak havoc upon the king's guard, and Ondoher and both his sons are killed in the disaster of the Morannon. After destroying the Haradrim in the south, Eärnil II brings his army north, catching the Easterlings by surprise in their celebration, and decimate their forces, driving the survivors back to the east. With the death of Ondoher and his heirs, both Arvedui and Eärnil II lay claim to the throne. Arvedui's claim comes from, and would hinge upon, reintroducing an ancient Númenórean law of accession, which would see the eldest child, not the eldest son, inherit the throne, in which case his wife Firiel would become the first ruling queen of Gondor. He also attempts to capitalize on the fact that he himself was the heir of Isildur, and that their children would symbolize this reunification of Gondor and Arnor. While the steward, Pelindur, and the Council of Gondor acknowledge the honor that the heir of Isildur title commands, they decree the king of Gondor must be of the line of Anarion, and the kingship passes to Eärnil II. Eärnil, who is described as both wise and humble, sends a message to Arvedui, saying, "I do not forget the loyalty of Arnor, nor deny our kinship, nor wish that the realms of Elendil should be estranged. I will send you aid when you have need, so far as I am able." This oath would be fulfilled as Arthedain continues to be plagued by its centuries-old enemy, the Witch King of Angmar. In the fall of 1973, Gondor receives word that Arthedain is about to be attacked as the Angmar War surpasses 400 years. Eärnil II sends his son Eärnor north with a fleet as great as they could spare. However, by the time they arrive, Arthedain is conquered, and Arvedui is drowned in the sea. Eärnur joins with Círdan, and the combined force of elves and men destroys the army of Angmar. Eärnur seeks to fight the Witch King, but his horse is terrified and flees the battle against its rider's wishes. The Witch King mocks him, but would himself flee at the coming of Glorfindel and the elves of Rivendell. It was in this moment that Glorfindel pronounced his prophecy, that not by the hand of man shall he fall. Being driven from the north, the Witch King would instead bring the war directly to Gondor. He returns to Mordor in 1980 and rallies the other 8 Nazgul to him. 20 years later, they lay siege to Minas Ithil, and in 2002 of the Third Age, they sack the city and take control of its Palantir and remake the city to a place of unspeakable evil. This once great city of Isildur is occupied by foul creatures and comes to be known as Minas Morgul, Tower of Dark Sorcery. This leads many Gondorians living in Ithilien to flee, depopulating the lands east of the river. After his father's death, Eärnur ascends to the throne in 2043. After his coronation, the Witch King sends him a challenge to single combat, while reminding him of his disgrace of seeming to flee the battlefield in the north. Fortunately, the steward, Mardil Voronwe, convinces the king not to go. However, 7 years later, in 2050, the Witch King renews his challenge, and this time, the king would accept. He sets his crown upon his father's lap in the houses of the dead, and with a small escort of knights, he rides across the river and past the gates of Minas Morgul. None of the company would ever be seen again. After the childless King Eärnur is killed by the Witch King in Minas Morgul, it is believed the line of Anarion has failed. No one with any tangential claim to the throne would come forward, for no one wanted to risk another kin-strife. At this time, Gondor is far from its previous heights, and another kin-strife would likely have destroyed the realm entirely. Thus, the rule of Gondor passes to the line of the stewards. Mardil Voronwe, the steward who attempted to dissuade Eärnur from marching to face the Witch King, becomes the first of these ruling stewards in 2050 of the Third Age. Out of respect for the king's position, the stewards would never sit on the throne of Gondor, but in their chair of black stone placed below it. They would also never wear a crown, but simply hold a white rod, a symbol of their position. Upon being sworn in, each steward pledged to hold rod and rule in the name of the king until he shall return. While certainly respected, it is not believed the latter portion of this pledge will ever come to fruition. There were none in Gondor descended from Isildur's direct line, and by this time the northern realm of Arnor was wiped out, the sole remnant being the relatively small group of Dunedain Rangers. The rule of the stewards would actually begin rather well. Mardil is said to have ruled with a steady hand, which is how he earns the moniker Voronwe, meaning the steadfast. And fortunately for his descendants, their rule would coincide with the period of time known as the Watchful Peace. During Mardil's rule, in 2063 of the Third Age, the wizard Gandalf the Grey went to Dol Guldur to investigate the shadow growing there. Not ready to reveal himself, this necromancer flees, and for nearly 400 years, Gondor and much of Middle-earth would have peace. While Sauron goes to the east, where he would work to corrupt the men of that land, his Nazgul look inward. Rather than plan attacks, they would instead prepare for Sauron's return, giving Gondor a respite from war. However, Gondor would use this opportunity to strengthen its borders with Mordor and Minas Morgul. Hador, the seventh ruling steward, is recorded as the last of his line to have a lifespan of a Dunedain, living to 150 years. At this point, the blood of Numenor waned, and the lifespan of the stewards would shorten closer to that of normal men. The Watchful peace comes to an end in 2460 of the Third Age, during the rule of Denethor I, not to be confused with Denethor II, who will meet nearly 500 years later. 15 years after Sauron returns to Dol Guldur, a new menace would be unveiled, the Uruk-hai. Unbeknownst to their enemies, the lords of Minas Morgul had bred this new race of orc. Faster, larger, stronger, and smarter than typical orcs, the Uruk-hai could travel in daylight without being weakened. They are unleashed from Mordor and conquer the lands of Ithilien, and sack the city of Osgiliath. Denethor's son, Boromir, leads the Gondorian forces in driving Uruks out of Osgiliath, reclaiming the once great capital. However, this would be the final blow to the city. Already damaged and depopulated starting with the earlier Kin-strife, Osgiliath is completely abandoned after the attack by the Uruk-hai. Boromir would succeed his father as steward in 2477 of the Third Age, and while he had previously won back Osgiliath, the steward would have to fight several campaigns to win back the lands of Ithilien from the orcs. While he would eventually win back the lands of Gondor, Ithilien would remain depopulated, and during the war he receives a Morgul wound. Despite his strength, which was great, Boromir would become shrunken with pain and die just 12 years into his rule. The rule of Gondor passes to Boromir's son, Cirion, who would become one of the realm's most famous stewards. He takes leadership of a kingdom where the corsairs of Umbar have begun raiding the coasts once more. Ithilien, the land bordering its closest enemy, is deserted, and their northern province of Calenarthon is almost completely depopulated. Between Calenarthon and the forts along the Anduin having been long abandoned, Cirion's primary concern is invasion from the north. He sends out spies so that he may be informed of any coming threats, and his men return with dire news. A new group of Easterlings has emerged, the Balcoth. Likely descended from the Wain Riders, the Balcoth were under the shadow of Dol Guldur, and using a large number of wagons, they were making their way westward. In the spring of 2509, Cirion receives word that hosts of these men are mustering along the southern border of Mirkwood, preparing to invade Gondor. Desperate for aid, Cirion sends out 6 volunteer riders to seek out their old allies, the Eotheid, from the far north. Of the 6 riders, only one would survive the 950-mile journey. Borondir delivers the Red Arrow, a symbol of the dire circumstances and a call for aid, to King Eorl the Young. Knowing the chances of word reaching the Eotheid were slim, and not knowing how they would respond, Cirion musters as great a force as he is able. He personally leads the army north to meet this new foe. However, the Balcoth cross the river Anduin and overpower the Gondorians, driving them north over the Limelight River. A bad situation gets worse as orcs descend from the Misty Mountains, pinning Cirion against the Anduin. In this moment when hope was lost, there was a sudden sounding of horns. The riders of Eorl had come. The Eotheid turned the tide of battle, driving the enemies away and pursuing the Balcoth across the fields of Calenarthon. 3 months later, Eorl comes to the Mering stream at the request of Cirion. Since the Battle of the Field of Celebrant, Cirion had cleared the path to Amon Anwar. Cirion offers Eorl all the lands of Calenarthon and for their people to live in perpetual alliance with one another. Eorl accepts, and their 2 parties ascend the hill, where Cirion reveals the secret tomb of Elendil. With his own son Halas, 2 counselors of Gondor, and the Prince of Dol Amroth as witnesses, Cirion pledges his bond with Eorl and his people. In response, Eorl pledges an oath of his own. Hear now all peoples who bow not to the shadow in the east. By the gift of the Lord of the Mundburg, we will come to dwell in the land that he names Calenarthon. And therefore I vow in my own name, and on behalf of the Eotheid of the north, that between us and the great people of the west, there shall be friendship forever.
Their enemies shall be our enemies, their need shall be our need. And whatsoever evil, or threat, or assault may come upon them, we will aid them to the utmost end of our strength. This vow shall descend to my heirs, all such as may come after me in our new land, and let them keep it in faith unbroken, lest the shadow fall upon them, and they become accursed. Kirion then made answer. Standing to his full height, he laid his hand upon the tomb, and in his right hand held up the white wand of the stewards, and spoke words that filled those who heard them with awe. For as he stood up, the sun went down in flame in the west, and his white robe seemed to be on fire. And after he had vowed that Gondor should be bound by a like bond of friendship and aid in all need, he lifted up his voice and said, "This oath shall stand in memory of the glory of the land of the star, and of the faith of Elendil the faithful, in the keeping of those who sit upon the thrones of the west, and of the one who is above all thrones, forever." Invoking the name of Iluvatar himself, such an oath had not been heard in Middle-earth since Elendil himself swore an allegiance with Gil-galad to form the last alliance of elves and men. Thus, Eorl becomes the first ruler of a new kingdom, the kingdom of Rohan, ever after in alliance with the men of Gondor. The names Rohan and Rohirrim being devised by Kirion's son, Halas. With Amon Anwar no longer making the midpoint of Gondor, Kirion removes the tomb of Elendil and has it placed in the Hallows of Rath-Dinin in Minas Tirith. The following 200 years would largely be peaceful ones for Gondor. Between 2628 and 2655, during the rule of Belecthor I, we are told the Corsairs of Umbar once again become a threat to Gondor, though no specific battles or events are recorded. During the rule of Ecthelion I, the Steward has the White Tower rebuilt in Minas Tirith. Standing 300 feet tall, the Great Tower shone like a spike of crystals, pearl, and silver. It would ever after be known as the White Tower of Ecthelion. The oath between Gondor and Rohan would be called upon multiple times over the coming centuries, though it would not always be answered. In 2710 of the Third Age, King Deor of Rohan would request the aid of Steward Elgamoth when Dunlending seized control of the Ring of Isengard. However, this came in a period of renewed war with the orcs, making Gondor unable to answer the call. Elgamoth's son Beren would spend much of his rule fighting the Corsairs of Umbar. During the long winter of 2758 to 2759, Gondor is assailed by 3 great fleets from Umbar and Harad, along the Gondorian coast as far north as the mouth of Isen. The northernmost of these forces joins with the Dunlendings in attacking King Helm Hammerhand's Rohan. Both kingdoms under attack, neither Gondor nor Rohan could assist the other for a long while. However, with spring on the horizon, Beren's son Baragon defeats the invading Corsairs and Haradrim. Thus, Gondor is finally able to send aid to Rohan, fulfilling the oath. Both Gondor and Rohan would survive these attacks, though Rohan's capital of Edoras was under enemy control for much of the winter. In the aftermath, Gondor is visited by one of the Astari. The wizard Saruman comes to Beren and requests permission to dwell in Isengard. Beren gladly agrees to having a wizard ally on the northern border of Rohan and gives him the key of Orthanc. Saruman by this time had already been seeking his own benefit, having researched much of the Rings of Power and deducing that one of the Palantiri remained in Orthanc. During the rule of Beren's son, Baragond, Gondor would once again be troubled by orcs. However, these orcs were not from Mordor. Instead, they were orcs fleeing the Battle of Azanabulzar, the climactic fight in the War of the Dwarves and Orcs. They take up residence in the White Mountains, and many battles would occur between men and orcs before the latter are destroyed. Still, Baragond's rule is largely a positive one, as Gondor begins to recover some of its strength. With the blood of Numenor still dwindling in the line of the stewards, Baragond's son Belecthor II is the last to live to 100 years old. Upon his death, the White Tree of Gondor also dies. However, the people of Gondor would leave it standing until the king comes. In 2882, Turin II becomes the 23rd ruling steward of Gondor, and would do much to secure the future of his realm. Ithilien was further deserted by his people due to invasions of orcs, but Turin II would not forsake these lands. He builds secret refuges for his soldiers in Ithilien so that they could combat this threat. The longest guarded and manned of these outposts was Heneth Anun, the very cave Faramir would take Frodo and Sam over 130 years later. But the greatest threat during Turin II's rule would come from the south. Ever since the Kin-strife, the lands of Horondor, also known as South Gondor, were a debated land between the corsairs of Umbar and the Kingdom of Gondor. By the time of Turin II, the Haradrim occupied South Gondor, and from there in 2885, they would launch an invasion of Ithilien with great force. Fortunately, King Folkwyne of Rohan would fulfill the Oath of Eorl and sends many Rohirrim to Gondor. Thanks to the assistance of Theoden's great-grandfather, Gondor succeeds in defeating the Haradrim. Still, with this invasion, Gondor completely withdraws its people from Ithilien. The only ones remaining in the realm are the Rangers of Ithilien, soldiers left to harass the forces of their enemy as they could. Around 2900 of the Third Age, Turin II would also refortify the river island of Caer Andros to protect Gondor from the north. The rule of Turin's son Turgon would be largely peaceful, but for one notable occurrence. In 2951, 10 years after being driven from Dol Guldur by the White Council, Sauron declares himself openly in Mordor and begins rebuilding Barad-dûr. Just 2 years later, Turgon's son Ecthelion II becomes the 25th ruling steward of Gondor. Ecthelion II is known for his wisdom and used all his power to strengthen Gondor in the face of a resurgent Sauron. He would strengthen both the haven of Pelargir and Caer Andros. He would encourage worthy men from both within Gondor and without to enter into his service in exchange for ranks and reward. One stranger who comes into the steward's service is a man named Thorongil, who had previously served King Thingol of Rohan. Ecthelion grew to love Thorongil above all others, possibly even his own son, Denethor II. Denethor grows bitter toward Thorongil, and much of their council was in opposition. Thorongil advised Ecthelion to not trust Saruman in Isengard, but to instead turn to Gandalf the Grey. Thorongil advises the steward that the corsairs of Umbar, the long-held enemies of Gondor, would prove a great threat to the southern fiefdoms if Sauron were to turn to open war. Ecthelion permits Thorongil to launch a surprise attack on the haven of Umbar, which severely damages the corsair fleet. Thorongil could have then returned to Minas Tirith with great honor, but instead sends a farewell message to Ecthelion, for other tasks now called him. For Thorongil would indeed return to Minas Tirith nearly 40 years later, as this descendant of both Isildur and Anarion would return under his rightful name, Aragorn, son of Arathorn. One who is not sorry to see this Thorongil disappear is Denethor II, who takes his role as 26th ruling steward just 4 years later in 2984. Denethor and his wife Finduilas, the sister of Prince Imrahil of Dol Amroth, had 2 sons, Boromir and Faramir. Boromir is doted upon by his father and is interested in great deeds of battle. Faramir, meanwhile, displeased his father in both his actions and his friendship with Gandalf the Grey. While not as highly regarded by his people as Thorongil had been, Denethor proves to be a more than capable ruler. He is quiet, listens to counsel, and is wise in his rule. However, just 4 years after rising to the role of steward, his wife Finduilas becomes one of many to fall under the shadow of Mordor, and dies at just 38 years old. Overcome with grief, Denethor becomes even more grim and silent. Also weighing on the steward is the continuing resurgence of Sauron. Denethor anticipates that it will be during his time that Sauron will make his great war upon Middle-earth. Despite its dwindling power over long centuries, Gondor is unquestionably the strongest of all the remaining realms that oppose Sauron. This makes the conquest of Gondor Sauron's primary objective in the coming war. The weight of these events, combined with overconfidence in his own willpower, leads Denethor to gaze into the long-forbidden Minas Anor Palantir to seek knowledge. Indeed, Denethor would be successful in gaining the knowledge he sought, so much so that we are told his people wondered at him. However, Sauron, who would use his captured ithil stone, discovers Denethor was also using one of the Palantiri. Sauron attempts to bring the Anor stone under his will, like he had done with Saruman and the Orthanc stone. However, he is unsuccessful. Denethor's strength of will, integrity, and right to use the stone wins out over even Sauron himself, though it comes at a cost. Denethor's already weakening body is given an even greater toll due to the stress of using the stone, and Sauron's apparent invincibility he sees in the Palantir. This causes the Steward to age prematurely. Sauron would finally launch the first attack of the War of the Ring on June 20th, 3018. While in outward appearance this attack on Osgiliath was made to test Denethor's strength, it also had the secret task of allowing the Nazgul to pass into Gondor undetected. To Sauron's dismay, Gondor is stronger than he believed. Boromir and Faramir defended, then destroyed the ancient bridge of Osgiliath, denying Sauron's forces access to the western side of the river. The night before the attack, the brothers had a prophetic dream, speaking of a halfling, a blade that was broken, and the land of Imladris. Denethor recognizes Imladris to be Rivendell and sends Boromir on the errand to find it, an errand from which he will never return. As Boromir heads north and joins the Fellowship of the Ring, Faramir is sent on March 1st to lead the Rangers of Ithilien. These lands that were so long a part of Gondor were now essentially held by the enemy. Operating out of places like Heneth Anun, the Rangers would raid the servants of Sauron like the Haradrim as often as they could. On the day Boromir is killed at Amon Hen, both Faramir and Denethor hear the horn of Gondor in the distance. 3 nights later, Faramir is sitting by the banks of the Anduin in Osgiliath, when he either sees or envisions a boat carrying his brother's body out to sea. 13 days after Boromir's death on March 9th, Gandalf and Pippin arrive in Minas Tirith. On their way, they had seen another great feature of Gondor, the warning beacons. The beacons had been in place since the late Second Age, and were used to warn the southern lands of danger in Calenarthon. With Calenarthon now Rohan, they are typically used to warn the people of Anorion of danger. That very day, the red arrow is delivered to King Theoden, a summons for aid from Denethor. And on March 10th, Sauron sends fumes from Mordor, blocking out the sun in much of Gondor and Rohan in what is known as the Dawnless Day. That very day, the Dark Lord sends his host from Minas Morgul, under the command of Gondor's old nemesis, the Witch King of Angmar. Also on March 10th, Faramir retreats across the Pelennor fields and is saved from the Nazgul by Gandalf the White. In preparation for an assault on Minas Tirith, most citizens of Gondor are sent to flee north and west. Those remaining behind are soldiers, healers, and boys who refuse to leave. In order to reinforce the capital, 3,000 men from the southern fiefs, including Belfalas and Dol Amroth, come to Minas Tirith. We are told these 3,000 soldiers are less than a tenth of what was needed. For while the Witch King marches closer to Minas Tirith, many in the south are preoccupied with fighting the Black Fleet of Umbar. Denethor sends Faramir to Osgiliath to intercept the Witch King's army on March 11th. The following morning, Sauron's host uses secret boats to cross the river and overwhelm the Gondorians, causing Faramir to retreat to the Causeway Forts on March 13th. Learning the Witch King was on the field of battle, Gandalf makes for the Ramas Ekor, where Faramir had retreated to. Thanks to a charge by his uncle Prince Imrahil, Faramir, wounded and suffering under the black breath of the Nazgul, is saved and brought back to Minas Tirith. As the Pelennor is overrun by Sauron's forces, Denethor is overcome with grief at his son's state. He loses his will to fight and gives no more thought to the defense of his city. Gandalf and Imrahil must take up command of Minas Tirith as the siege of Gondor begins. Throughout the day of March 14th, the hosts of Mordor dig pits and build siege weapons on the Pelennor. The Nazgul continue flying over the city, bringing despair to the soldiers awaiting the battle. The orcs launch stones into the city which burst into flame, followed by catapulting the severed heads of slain Gondorians over the city walls. And with the morale of the Gondorians at its lowest point, the Witch King begins his assault around midnight. The might of the Wall of Gondor and the steadfastness of many of their people held out for a time against the invaders. However, the Great Gate of Minas Tirith is broken by the battering ram Grond. In rides the Lord of the Nazgul, and there is only one who stands in defiance of him, Gandalf the White upon Shadowfax. And unlike Eärnur's steed so long ago, Shadowfax would not flee the Witch King. Just as the Witch King draws his blade, which erupts with flames, horns begin to blow in the distance. Rohan had come. Thus, the morning of March 15th brings the climax of the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, the largest and greatest of the War of the Ring. Theoden's Rohirrim strike a mighty blow to the forces of Mordor. He personally kills the chieftain of the Haradrim before being struck down by the Witch King himself. The Witch King in turn is killed by Merry and Éowyn. While this loss is hugely demoralizing for Sauron's army, Gothmog, lieutenant of Minas Morgul, assumes command, and the Southrons charge with their Mumakil. Éomer, having discovered his sister seemingly dead upon the battlefield, flies into a rage, fully prepared to die as Rohan's final leader. Another prepared to die as the final ruler of his people is Denethor, though under very different circumstances. Denethor prepares a funeral pyre for him and Faramir to burn. While Gandalf and Pippin would save Faramir, Denethor lights himself ablaze. One reason for Denethor's despair was a vision Éomer would see come to fruition. Denethor had seen a fleet of enemy ships with black sails arriving at the Ramas, prepared to enter the fight. Éomer beholds this development and believes the final stroke has come, and the Rohirrim and Gondorians will soon be destroyed. However, it was not their enemy in these ships, for Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, the sons of Elrond, and the Grey Company had walked the paths of the dead, and the dead men had driven the Haradrim and Corsairs from the Gondorian settlements and havens. Aragorn then commandeered the black ships, bringing many reinforcements from the southern fiefdoms who had flocked to the banner of the heir of Isildur. Rather than Éomer being caught against overwhelming odds, the host of Mordor is now caught between hammer and anvil, and the Battle of the Pelennor Fields is a victory for Gondor and Rohan, the Oath of Eorl once again fulfilled. After the victory, Aragorn furls his banner and makes camp outside the city. He appoints Imrahil the temporary lord of the city as per Gondorian law. Aragorn would later enter the city in secret, coming to the Houses of Healing, where he healed Merry, Éowyn, and Faramir, all of whom were suffering under the Black Breath. Greater than any genealogy was this fulfillment of a prophecy. The hands of the king are the hands of a healer, and so shall the rightful king be known. Word spread throughout the city, and Aragorn would work late into the night healing the citizens of Gondor. After taking counsel with Gandalf, Éomer, Imrahil, Elladan, and Elrohir, Aragorn resolves to lead a force in a distractionary attack upon Mordor, in hopes it would give Frodo a chance to destroy the One Ring. This force of 7,000 leaves Minas Tirith on March 18th. It is estimated that a defensive force of around 9,000 is left to protect the city, featuring Rohirrim, soldiers from the southern fiefdoms, and survivors of the city. The host of the west would meet an army of Sauron's orcs, trolls, Haradrim, and Easterlings numbering over 60,000. The great eagles would of course also come to the battle and aid the men, and the One Ring is indeed destroyed, causing the destruction of Sauron, the Nazgul, Barad-dûr, the Black Gate, and most of Sauron's forces. With the great enemy permanently disembodied and never again a threat, Aragorn returns to Minas Tirith, where Faramir, now Steward of Gondor, leads the ceremony crowning Aragorn King of Gondor and Arnor. Aragorn reinstates the role of Steward of Gondor as it had once been before the line of kings failed, and makes Faramir both Steward of Gondor and Prince of Ithilien. In time, Ithilien would indeed become populated once more. One group who came to dwell there are some elves of Mirkwood, led by Legolas, and it is said Ithilien once again became the fairest country in all the Westlands. As for Aragorn, he would be taken up the slopes of Mount Mindolluin behind Minas Tirith by Gandalf, and there would find a sapling of the White Tree of Gondor, planting it in place of the long-dead tree, which is taken to the houses of the dead. After her arrival with her father, grandmother, and grandfather, Arwen marries Aragorn in Minas Tirith on Midsummer's Day 3019. Now king of the reunited kingdom of Gondor and Arnor, Aragorn sets to reordering his realm. He orders the restoration of Orthanc, and has the Palantir returned there. He declares the Druidan Forest a protected realm of his kingdom belonging to the Druidine. The Shire is likewise declared a free land under the protection of his kingdom, and he forbids men from entering it without the leave of the halflings. He also expands the Shire to include the lands as far west as Emin Bereid. Together, Aragorn and Éomer renew the oaths of Cirion and Eorl, and due to the effects of Sauron's influence, we are told Éomer would often fulfill the oath, for there were many enemies to defeat before the White Tree could grow in peace. Together, Aragorn and Éomer would ride to both the east and south of Middle-earth, fighting and defeating the last remnants of those loyal to Sauron. We are told specifically Aragorn makes peace with the Haradrim after his coronation, and that the threat of the Corsairs was finally subdued during his reign, and the haven of Umbar finally retaken. The reign of King Aragorn II Elessar would bring prosperity not seen in Gondor for centuries. He would rule for 122 years before his death on March 1st, 120 of the Fourth Age. At this time, his son Eldarion would take the throne, inheriting a reunited kingdom unburdened by the threat of Sauron, or great enemies influenced by his presence. He is left to lead Gondor further into the new Fourth Age of Middle-earth. While we don't know much canonically of Eldarion's reign, the waning of his rule serves as the backdrop for Tolkien's abandoned sequel. To learn about that story, check out my video on The New Shadow. As always, I want to say a huge thank you to all my Patreon and YouTube supporters who make this channel possible. Tom DeBombadil 19, Lissamy the Cinda, Rabbi Rob Thomas, Charles Leisure, CCDC Red Team, Joe Tepper, The Mighty Mim, Andrew Carlisle, Swirled Traveler, Matthew Jeffrey, Leo Vittori, Sky Carcass, Slide Belts, Dane Ragnarsson, Berto Berg, Graham Derricott, The Dark-Haired One, Wyland, Micah Wu, and Debbie. If you enjoyed the artwork in this video, check out the artists in the description to purchase prints of their great work for yourself. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time on Nerd of the Rings.